Hi everyone, I'm Bill Kirkpatrick. I'm a volunteer with the Barrington Conservation Land Trust, and we're here at Johannis Farm Nature Preserve, one of the beautiful properties of the Land Trust. This was acquired in 1990 or so for the sum of $650,000 from the Johannis family. This farm had been in the Johannis family for several generations. And the money came from Rhode Island open space bonds, town open space bonds, and the Land Trust. There are 32 acres total, 28 in Barrington and 4 over the Swansea line. As we'll take a walk down to the Marshland and see at the end of this really beautiful long field that the Marshland is part of a contiguous section of salt marsh of over 100 acres owned by the Swansea Land Trust, Barrington Land Trust, and the Audubon Society. So with that, we will take a stroll down and stop now and again and provide some background about the property, a little bit about Native American history, and early history of settlers in Barrington. So join us. So we're going to go down all the way to the end of the field, right along the edge of the forest there. There's a whole section there we're not going to go into. That's where some of the rare plants are in the eagle's nest. So we're trying to stay away from that. We'll go down to the marsh, we'll cross a bridge, go up along the river, come back through this section of woods and back out here. So here you get a great view of the open field and meadow that was part of the original Johannis farm. Over to the left you see a couple of bat boxes that were erected last year. That was a Boy Scout project. Throughout the property there are some bridges or crossways that were other Boy Scout projects that we're very thankful for. This field was mowed about a month or so ago, and there's a little bit of controversy about mowing as it relates to preservation. There's a little bit of a balance. If we left a field like this fallow for years, it would resort to woodland. On the other hand, if we mow it, we would eliminate a lot of the flowers, wildflowers, etc. for the pollinators. So you'll see these little islands that were left intact after the mowing. The flowers that really have gone by, but 2 or 3 weeks ago there was still some goldenrod and some other flowers, and there were bees all over the place. Milkweed, which is a supporter of monarch butterflies. So there is a balance, and we've been able to kind of strike that here at Johannis, I think. So this is an example of one of the projects here on the farm property. This was a project by Troop 4 of Barrington Boy Scouts in 1992. So once these bridges or projects are completed, it then becomes the Land Trust's responsibility to maintain it, of course. And we'll see a couple other examples of bridges and walkways over lower, kind of boggy area. And this fills up when we don't have a drought. And we can see some of the marsh sort of vegetation pretty far from the marsh itself. It's sort of intruding into the woods here. So one of the, I guess the unintended consequences of the mowing was that it sort of opened up some of the vistas or sight lines of some of the features. So we see some of the open areas, and over to my right is another open area. Walking through this area during the summer, you would not have been able to see very clearly that pond until you got right up to it. I was walking through here last year in the fall, coming from the other direction, and the grass was pretty high, probably about waist high. And I happened to glance over to my right and saw 2 pairs of eyes that turned out to be coyotes, kind of spying on me. And I sort of stopped, and they didn't move, and then finally they left. So that was kind of cool to see that. And that's another reason why this property was so identified as being so valuable, because of the diverse habitat, the diversity of wildlife and birds that are on the property. So the early settlers of Barrington began to populate areas such as this area, which was referred to by the Native Americans as the Solom's area, or Solom's. To the settlers, to the early English settlers, this area was referred to as New Meadow Neck, and then eventually the name was changed to Hampton Meadows in honor of John Hampton, who was apparently an emissary that visited the Poconokeets, and particularly Assamiquan. And we'll say more about that later, but they had a very good relationship for a number of years. This is the site of the very first brickyard in Barrington, and they were, once the clay was discovered, there were clay pits that were dug, and once the bricks were fired up in the kiln, they were shipped down to Warren, and some of them were used as ballast on the sailing ships that were sailing out of Warren. There's still evidence of the clay pits, and actually shards of brick and whole bricks, which are now, protected by the property. And there is also evidence of a canal that was dug out in order to bring probably a small barge up close to the pits to be able to load the bricks onto them. There are also a couple of other canals that were dug earlier in the century, I believe, or the previous century, for mosquito control. So we'll continue on and go down to the marsh proper. So here we are at the salt marsh complex, and we come upon this beautiful open vista. We're at low tide, and that's intentional because it gets pretty wet down here. But you can see the whole lay of the land, and actually if we look straight out there at the Marshland complex heading south, and those buildings we see there is Warren. Panning over to further out on the Palmer River, we see some osprey nests. They're not around presently, and sort of a informal pathway. This kind of gives you an indication of when it's wet, people throw wood down to walk across, so that has to get fixed somehow. Egrets, it's a blue heron, so osprey, eagles if I'm lucky. So it's just a beautiful area. So one of the reasons why this property was so valued by the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management and the Land Trust and the Barrington Conservation Commission was the diversity of habitat and the wildlife, protection of some rare plants and animals. But also this is considered one of the most complex and important salt marsh areas in the state. And it's now considered a sentinel salt marsh and being studied as part of, my understanding, a statewide effort to monitor the effects of rising sea levels on these salt marshes. One of the dangers is that as the sea level rises, the plant life is underwater for a longer period of time, and that erodes some of the root structure. The crabs that live along these little canals here then can dig further into the banks and kind of nibble on the roots, and thereby endangering some of the plant life. So that's one of the things that's being studied and observed over time. Once again, we come to this really beautiful vista. We're looking out over the salt marsh to the Palmer River, and then across the river to Swansea, and then eventually Warren. This granite marker marks the boundary between Barrington and Swansea, and as I mentioned before, there are 4 acres that are part of the Johannis Farm Preserve. There are another 30 acres or more to the north that are owned and managed by the Swansea Land Trust. And then to the south, as I mentioned, a lot of the rest of the salt marsh complex is owned by Land Trust and the Audubon Society. We're moving away from the salt marsh, or heading up into the upland, back to the upland area of the property. But there is still some beautiful views out over the Palmer, and lots of great shots of birds, of course, and the river itself. So we'll keep moving along. So here's another interesting sight line here as we move away from the salt marsh, back up to the uplands, if you will. Again, lots of shorebirds, ducks, and egrets, and other wildlife. We can hear off in the distance Route 6 and Route 195, and we are in the Swansea section of the property. As we had talked about before, this whole area referred to as Soames was sort of the home, if you will, of the Pocono tribe, the precursor to the Wampanoag tribe. Is that correct? And the Native Americans and the settlers had a peaceful alliance for a number of years. So we know that there was a lot of exchange between the settlers and the Native Americans. Once the English settlers began to purchase property, apparently most, if not all, of the property on New Meadow Neck, or Hampton Meadows, was in and continues to be in private holdings or private land, with the exception of now Johannis Farm and a couple of schools. Was that the Land Trust also collaborates with other individuals and groups in doing other research. So recently there was some interest in studying beech leaf disease that's showing up in New England. There aren't many beeches on this property, but there are other projects that we've collaborated with before. So it's a sort of a living laboratory, if you will, and collaboration between groups. So we've come full circle on our trip through much of the preserve, and we're coming back out of the woodland into the open field. We'll take a walk by the bat boxes that were erected last year by the Boy Scouts, and hope you enjoyed the trip.